From 2014 to 2023, Dungeons & Dragons was more popular than ever. And throughout the history of the game, whenever Dungeons & Dragons has been popular, so has the rest of the hobby. However, recently, the hobby has continued to expand even though Dungeons & Dragons appears to be waning in popularity. And who better to discuss that than Mike Mearls, who helped design both 4th edition D&D and 5th edition D&D. Mike has done a number of videos recently, one of which with Ben Riggs, another with Ben Milton from Questing Beast. And I've had the opportunity to react to both of those videos and discuss them on our podcast, Casual Fridays, with Jim and Ryan, part of our Landlocked Warlocks YouTube channel. So this video here synthesizes all of those discussions to answer a few questions. What have we learned about D&D 5e over the past 10 years? Is D&D still cool? Is D&D dead? And if it is dead, where is the hobby going, if it's going anywhere, without Dungeons & Dragons?
Like, I call it 5.5. Like, that's also really telling. We don't know what to call it. Wizards doesn't have a name for it, so I'm going to call it 5.5.
One thing I really like is Mike Mearls calls it 5.5.
And points out that it should have a name.
Yeah, he said that. He said, they don't even know what to call it, which felt, that was a dig. That was definitely a dig. He said 5.5 has you doing, quote, has you too much, quote, doing math in your head. Too focused on the rules. He said it's too much like 3.5 or 4th edition. He said it's more like those editions than 5.5. I don't know if I feel it's that intensely crunchy compared to older editions, but I think he's right that it does have you doing more math in your head. The first thing he said I thought was really interesting was that 5th edition was designed for fans of WoW, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and Skyrim. Now, I don't know if that's just his hindsight opinion looking back on it, or if any of those were deliberate design goals, like appealing to fans of Skyrim and Game of Thrones. I've never heard those before out of anyone at WotC's mouth.
I could definitely see like a Skyrim influence, especially like if you compare the dungeon design in like almost all of the starter boxes, right? The dungeons are significantly smaller, like bordering on like 5-room dungeon design. Which is very similar to the dungeon design in Skyrim, right? Most of the dungeons in Skyrim are these short little, loops that you can get in and out of fairly quickly, right? There's a few that are attached to like the main storylines that are larger, more comprehensive dungeons that we're used to from earlier editions of D&D. But I could certainly see, I could certainly see Skyrim influences in the early 5e products for sure.
He said that when they were designing 5e, he said, if we fail, let's fail by being too accessible. Clearly feeling the weight of 4e's heavy design.
Right. Well, 4e and third, right? Third and 3.5 have, very heavy design to them as well. And third was, or 3.5 as a unit, those two were pretty popular, right? But he talked about that too. Like, didn't he say that after the initial release, a lot of that, a lot of those sales really dropped off, that there wasn't a lot of staying power with 3.5.
And coming to the conclusion, he said the 3rd edition, like that surge then fall, that really put me down this trail, because it was just taken as gospel that, hey, 3rd edition like blew 2nd edition away in terms of sales. But when you looked at it, what you saw was, a lot of people from 2nd edition hopped in, but then they just hopped right back out.
Which was a very interesting point, because that was my experience. Like, I loved 3rd when I first read it, and went out and bought 3.5 as soon as it came out. But we never played it enough, right? We never like really stuck with it. And so I definitely experienced that, like, not feeling the staying power of 3.5.
I remember being there when 5e came out. I'd only started playing role-playing games shortly before that. So I was there during the play tests and seeing it all get released. And what I remember is, at the time, at least in the whole OSR community, it was like heralded as like the triumph of the OSR, as like the ultimate old school RPG, where it's like, we've won, this whole like, attitude, which is really funny when you compare it to now, when it's just like, 5e, that's just for the normies. You got to go back to the OSR. It's this really funny shift in culture. I don't know if you had any comments on just like the way that the culture has shifted in the 5e over time.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting, and I think that is like, if I was in charge of D&D, I'd be so worried about that.
I agree. The reason I liked fifth edition was because it did feel more like the first and second edition that I grew up on. So, I didn't feel the crunch in 5e the way I did with 3 and 4.
I found it all very interesting, just as historical perspective, or like parting the curtains of like, well, fourth edition didn't work, and we thought this was going to be the last version of D&D, not because it's one D&D to rule them all, but because we might not be making D&D anymore pretty soon because the sales aren't there, and we can't make fourth edition. We know that didn't work. And we can't really go back to 3.5 because Paizo captured that market. So we have to make something new that's going to bring new people in and maybe get those people who were playing 20 years ago in. And lo and behold, they did that.
But because Pathfinder existed, and Pathfinder basically, they already did that. They took 3.5 and were like, well, we play the heck out of this game. I know a lot of people who were at Paizo at the time. They played a lot of D&D. They wrote a lot of D&D books. So they took 3.5 and cleaned it up. So for us to come in and say, okay, we're just going to take 3.5 and clean it up, like, well, we're just recreating Pathfinder. Now we're fighting with Pathfinder for their audience.
The whole necessity is the mother of invention thing, right? So the way Mike described it is they were kind of painted into a corner, like they're backed into a corner with 5e. Like, what are we going to do? We can't make it like 4. We can't make it like 3 because Pathfinder's already done that. So, how do we come out of this corner? Well, you got to come out swinging. You got to do something. Be creative, be innovative. History has shown that 5e was a better product because they had to take a stand on, all right, what is this game going to be?
And I think he said something that really interested me. He said each successive edition cared less about making the entry point fun. Like he said, third edition is great if you already like D&D. There were several things he said throughout the interview that gave me the impression that he really cares about the newcomer experience. He's very concerned about the newcomer experience to tabletop RPGs, and I think he's right about that with D&D. That like if you like third edition, there's a chance you like fourth edition. If you've never seen any D&D at all, fourth edition wouldn't be the one you'd pick, right? Or third edition, or 3.5, or basically anything except for fifth edition or some of the early simpler editions. New players like the essence of things. That was a quote that stuck with me because he said that new players want to get to the fun quickly. They're not as interested in the crunch of it. They want to get to the essence of it. What's the fun part? What are we trying to do here at this table? I found that very interesting and refreshing to hear. Because with all the 5.5 stuff, it's all just been about here's new features, there's more crunch, you're getting all this additional stuff. Are you people happy yet?
The other thing Mike mentioned, talking about like when they were looking for what is it our fans want, right? So the playtest accomplished some of that. Like we actually put it in front of fans, see what they think, get their feedback. The other thing is they went back and looked at sales, right? He said they went back and were surprised to find out that the Rules Cyclopedia, which is the BECMI version, was still selling really well. And that was, I think, was another tip in the direction of let's streamline this. Let's make things easier and more accessible. Because there was value to those, the BX and the BECMI editions.
I mean, they're still wildly popular. Like I played Old School Essentials the other night, and like it's basically a cleaned up version of all of that. And ooh, do I love it? Dungeon Crawl Classics. There's a ton of that's a whole OSR, right? Is built on those retro clones and has evolved from there. The other thing he said that really, like, I hope that somebody heard at WotC is that they're sitting in some ivory tower somewhere or whatever, some dark crystal pinnacle in Seattle. They're slightly outside in some boardroom, and they're seeing the gap between them and the number 2 guy, and the gap between them and the number 3 guy is so much more. And what Mearls said is, you don't understand. It's not you versus Paizo. It's you versus everybody who's not you. And I think that was valid before they made a bunch of choices that vilified themselves, and now it's even more true. And based on their actions, I don't think Wizards thinks like that, or whatever corporate arm of Hasbro is controlling Wizards policy. Yep. Clearly doesn't think like that. Doesn't realize the threat that, like, oh, okay, this little upstart company is 1% compared to what you are. There's 1,000 of those companies, and you spawned, and they used to work with you, and now they're working against you because of your greed.
Yeah, I wrote down this quote. Is there anyone at Wizards who wakes up in the morning and thinks, how can I make the tabletop role-play game better? I don't think so. Or they're so far down the org chart they have no power. Ouch. And this other one, he talked a bit about, he addressed one of the big concerns a lot of people are having with the Monster Manual is the removal of the lore. And he would reference the He said Spelljammer, but I think he was referencing the Hadesy incident. The Hadesy incident, and he said that after that, after they kept screwing up, they said, we don't know what the audience wants, and we don't want the audience to get upset. So what if we just say nothing? And that's led to the wholesale, burning of lore out of a lot of these things. And I can see that. I can see a conversation like that actually kind of happening. Like, we keep putting our foot in our mouth. Maybe we should just stand still for a while. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, to answer Twin Seal's question, what's the corporate speak for the lack of knowledge, the institutional knowledge? That's the phrase you're looking for, Twin Seal. And there does seem to be a significant lack of institutional knowledge at WotC, because it sure seems like they keep repeating the same mistakes, right? Yeah. I mean, Mike even talked about the really strict version of the gaming license that they came out with at 4th edition. That's what led to Paizo creating Pathfinder, right? When they realized that, hey, they've turned against us. Here we are making all these products for 3.5, and now they're moving on to a new edition, and they're trying to leave us in the dust. Well, we need to make a game that supports all the products we've been making for the last several years, and introduce Pathfinder. And now, they've made the same mistake, creating the OGL debacle, and now MCDM and Critical Role. They're all making their own games.
Yeah, we opened the show talking about Shadowdark.
Yeah,
I mean, it was coming anyway, but it wouldn't be what it is now.
No, I've talked to Kelsey briefly on this subject, and she's very aware that, like, as much as the OGL debacle sent her into crisis mode, because her Kickstarter was about to launch when all this stuff went down, and she was like, do I have to go in and scrub my books of all this WotC related terminology? And so she was actually working on, frantically working to revamp Shadowdark. So it was a huge ordeal for her to go through. But the end result, though, is, with everything going into Creative Commons and the OGL stuff settling down, she was able to release her original vision of the game. But then on top of that, clearly Shadowdark did really well because people were ready for something not WotC related.
But what's been interesting to me is that role-playing game culture is still there. And this is what I find fascinating about gaming in general, but especially TTRPGs. I don't think we've ever had a period where TTRPGs were flourishing and had a lot of energy and excitement around them, and D&D wasn't on the upswing. Because I do think that's what's happening now in very strange waters, where I think D&D is now uncool. But it's not like the audience is shrinking.
I think we can all agree on that. In fact, I would even double down on that and say, it's not just that D&D is not cool. It's that the cool thing is to hate on D&D.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of where we're at least in the social media environment. As far as us being on YouTube, we almost every video I put up, I get a handful of comments about, well, just don't play it. Just don't play it. Play something else, right? And so I think that's the cool thing to do, to hate on D&D. And they went into further discussion about kind of the direction of D&D and the RPG community as far as what's going to be popular, what's not. And that they talked about how Wizards of the Coast has probably lost a sizable market share. They specifically mentioned Matt Colville's game and Sanderson's game. Those are two of the examples they gave of games that are going to be taking large chunks of market share, in Mike's opinion. My thing is, I think it's clear that there's a dip in the popularity of D&D right now, like a significant one, because of what I just said about how it's cool to hate on D&D right now. However, I also run games for kids, and I see young kids all the time who are just dying to get into this hobby, right? Elementary school kids who, 4 or 5 years from now are going to be high school kids with spending money, and who are going to be old enough and smart enough to be DMing their own games soon, right? So the 4th and 5th graders that I run games for now, it's not going to be long before they're grown and they're full-fledged members of this hobby. And there's a bunch of them out there. There's a bunch of kids that are just chomping at the bit to get into this hobby. So I don't think D&D is ever going to, die off.
There was a lot of thinking in a lot of products that was based on taking trends from the summer of 2020 in terms of what people were doing, how they were consuming media, and just extending those out to infinity and assuming that's the new. And that is obviously not what happened, because there's been the game industry has just been massacred the past few years, massive layoffs, massively funded games completely flopping.
I think probably the biggest thing is like there's a regression towards the mean, right? We had a big spike in popularity in 2020 with the pandemic, and leading up to that with Stranger Things and Critical Role. In the grand history of this, I think that we're just going to see a regression. This is a regression towards the mean, kind of a stabilization point, and then D&D is going to steadily start growing. So if like we were to graph it, there'd be this big spike from like 2016 to 2020, and then a big drop off around 2023, and now it's just kind of gradually climbing back up.
I think you're absolutely right, Brad. I think probably what we're going to see in the future is at the biggest part of the funnel is all these kids who've heard the name Dungeons and Dragons. They've never heard the name Pathfinder. They've never heard the name DC-20 or Daggerheart or Drawsteel. They've never heard, but they a 6-year-old knows what Dungeons and Dragons is, kinda. You're going to see more, at that top part of the funnel. But then I think once those kids get more to teenagers, you're going to see more splitting off into the other big popular games. Whereas maybe in the past, more of those kids would have stayed in the D&D ecosystem. But like Drawsteel, it's going to be a popular game, and it's going to siphon off more than. But I still think D&D is the funnel. It's the entry point, the starting point for the majority of the addicts who get into TTRPGs.
I think the nuanced truth is that Hasbro shot themselves in the foot big time with the OGL thing. That's been beaten to death, but like, I was never surprised that they were trying to do the most profitable thing possible. I was surprised that they thought that was the most profitable thing possible, because they've spawned a diaspora of partners and transformed them into competitors. And we've seen this movie before. They did that 20 years ago, and the same thing happened. So I think it's unequivocally true that D&D is suffering as a brand in the aftermath of all of that, at a point where this should be, the line should have continued the trajectory of like the 50th anniversary, Baldur's Gate 3, major motion picture, new everything coming out. This should be the peak, and it's hard to counterfactuals, but like I think it would have been had it not been for all of that. All of that could be true while simultaneously D&D is and will remain the biggest thing in this industry. And if you want to talk to someone new, whether they're a 5th grader or a 20-year-old or a 50-year-old who just has never entered the hobby before, they're coming through the gate of D&D. And if you meet them at that gate saying, that thing that you just got into sucks, you should really try my thing, you're not going to really get anywhere in that conversation. You got to meet these people where they are. If you're trying to get them to play Pathfinder or Nimble or Shadowdark with you, yeah, D&D is cool, and this is better, this is why, they're a little more refined, make your pitch. But there's a lot of people running around with pitchforks still, being like, D&D sucks, go play my game instead, because it's cooler ethically for some reason. And that's not how you convert people.
Yeah, and Mr. Welch nails it right here, right? The only thing players care about is quality. Everything else is distractions, and you don't want to distract people from your product, right? And Wachi just has gotten really good at doing that. Even just last week, we were talking about not having orc and drow stat blocks in the monster manual. Just don't do stupid stuff like that, right? Like little things, as you're the big dog on the playground, right? You're the one everybody's watching, and if you make changes without really thinking about how your fans are going to perceive those changes, then you're just putting more distractions out there. So everybody's hypersensitive about everything these days. And it's just, don't do stuff like that. Don't give distractions with your brand new product. And overall, I think 5.5 is a good game. I think there's quality there. It's not a bad game by any stretch. But they've given so many distractions over the last 2 years.
Foot in mouth disorder.
Role-playing games, the users are experts. They know the stuff inside and out. They know exactly what they want, and they have very specific needs. And if you miss even just by a little, they just don't have any use for your project, for your product. Maybe like 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, but nowadays there's so much stuff out there that you can find what you want. And so the decision maker has to be very close to the user. You've got to know that user inside and out, and you've got to have like telemetry, like constantly seeing what's changing. And what I think happened was, because D&D is owned by Hasbro, it's a giant corporation, that as D&D became more important at Hasbro, that distance increased. I don't think it means like, oh, D&D is dead forever. I mean, I think big brands, big franchises always go through, good times, bad times, just as what happens. But I think that the challenge they have right now is they have this 2020 strategy. They're kind of locked into it. It's a big company. It's going to take them a while to change direction. And I think fundamentally, like if someone from Wizards was listening to this, I'd say what you just need to do is you need to decrease that distance.
Can Wizards of the Coast close that distance? And will D&D ever be this popular again? And if D&D is never this popular again, will the tabletop community be fine without them? Let me know your thoughts. And thanks again for watching The Dire Den.